demon?
Hold on.
We are talking Bermuda Island, and this is directed by Adam Worth. And when I first watched this movie, I thought it might be a kind of mockbuster of the recent Gerard Butler movie, Plane. But in actual fact, it's actually more like Lost meets Lord of the Flies with bloodthirsty vampire orcs. That's kind of the logline here. So what is the story? Well, it focuses on aeroplanes full of passengers who are going through this kind of like seemingly uneventful kind of journey on this plane. However, they hit a mysterious storm which downs their plane, and a group of survivors wash up on the shores of this mysterious island, we assume in Bermuda. And obviously a number of people have been killed, but there's a reasonably large group of survivors. However, this island seems initially to be uninhabited outside of a few kind of creepy crawlies and stuff, but there seems to be a mysterious other element here, and that is in fact seemingly a tribe of what can only be described as kind of Lord of the Rings kind of style orcs, or I guess if you've seen the H.G. Wells' Time Machine movie, because they look a little bit like that on the other hand, and they are after blood and seem to be wanting to consume the blood of our victims. Not only that, we actually have a mysterious human survivor who seems to be a kind of a survivor from a kind of previous crash, and maybe even a man out of time. Now, as the time goes on, our survivors end up kind of splitting into two kind of rival factions, not only dealing with each other, but of course the threat of these kind of orc-like creatures. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's discuss. Now, preface this by saying this is a low-budget B-movie. A low-budget B-movie. The kind of consistency of writing here clearly wasn't at the forefront of the filmmakers, and I'll come on to a little bit about that. So, straight away, if you kind of want a strong narrative with developed characters and sort of, very clear kind of like ideas of what's going on and themes, that ain't going to be the movie for you. If you want to watch lots of people getting chewed up by orc-looking creatures, then I've got some good news for you. So, yeah, it's a low-budget film. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that. But this movie is quite, peppered through the movie with lots of kind of action sequences, lots of encounters with various kind of dangers with the time on the island and the kind of the plane crash itself. So it's certainly not a movie which I would say is dull in some ways. There's always kind of something around the corner, a sort of a short skirmish, an action sequence, peppered quite regularly through the movie. So we get quite a lot of kind of violence in this movie. And initially I thought there was too many characters in this film, to be honest with you. It's hard to keep track of this many survivors. But in actual fact, a lot of them are kind of disposable, meat sacks for these kind of like orc-like creatures to kind of eat and chow through. So, despite I think it may be you don't really get the sense of much in the way of characters, it does give an excuse for a high kind of body count and various kind of deaths via, chowing down on one's neck or kind of a, spear through the kind of the chest and things like that. So yeah, a relatively kind of high body count, lots of kind of like action sort of sequences and kind of like fight scenes and things. Let's talk about effects. So the actual effects here, we have a mixture of kind of CGI stuff to do with the kind of the plane and the storm really, but our creatures are all practical effects. And there's a little bit of CGI blood here and there, but they're all practical kind of like suits and things, and they're sometimes they look a bit ropey, I won't lie, but for the most part, again, I think if you're accepting of you're watching a B movie, you can kind of enjoy the kind of like this kind of orc-like aesthetic that these kind of things have, and just enjoy the kind of like this like weird sort of film that is on display here, so that it makes it kind of a very schlocky, but kind of like cheesy fun kind of experience here. The movie does try and have a little bit of a kind of a twist. I think it's reasonably obvious, and a very, let me say, bold ending to this film. I don't know if people will be satisfied. I kind of liked the bold ending, I won't lie, but I can imagine it not being satisfying for some, to be honest. Again, it's a low-budget movie, but I do feel that there's at least the kind of the location shooting here works pretty well. It's a little bit vague with kind of where they are and what's kind of going on in certain aspects, and you know how deserted are they, because we do see a sequence where they find some type of like building which has clearly got like brickwork on it, so clearly someone's been there before, but it's kind of like looks like it's old and decrepit, fair enough, but it just kind of is there, but there's lots of kind of natural environment and etc, and you know, beach shots and things, and you know there are some elements here that I kind of enjoyed. And it's obviously taking cues from things like Plane, Lost, Lord of the Flies, and whatever creatures these are supposed to be looking like. But so yeah, it's kind of like as a mishmash of all those ideas, which, you know, I suppose it shouldn't really work, but I kind of still found it a fun element to this film. I mean, this is one of these films which is clearly not been particularly kind of well thought through, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But if you can kind of, it's definitely a switch your brain off, and if you don't mind low budget slog, there is a little bit of fun to be had here. But let's go into what does not work. This film has a weird tendency to have side plots and B storylines that either don't matter at all or seem to go absolutely nowhere. For example, at the beginning of the movie, they make a big hoo-ha about this kind of criminal who we see in an action sequence getting apprehended at the beginning of the movie. And he's kind of taken on this aeroplane as a kind of a transport with a couple of FBI agents. So this is why I thought it was going to be like the movie Plane that stars Gerard Butler. But that plot goes absolutely nowhere. I won't say exactly what happens, but it's kind of just cut dead, is all I'll say. And it's like, why did we even introduce that? It has literally no bearing on the plot. And it's kind of like, why even have that? And then we have the kind of for example, the splitting off of the two sort of factions of the group. It seems entirely superfluous. It doesn't really have much in the way of impact outside of making one guy who's meant to be a professional government employee do things that seem very counterintuitive to what you would probably do in a kind of a situation like this. And kind of very sort of unrealistic. Not that this movie is trying to be realistic by any means, but it just seems like they wanted to have a group, you know, this kind of splitting of the group, because that's what kind of Lord of the Flies did. How are we going to do it? A convoluted kind of reason which doesn't really make any sense, and people don't act like they really should be in that kind of situation. So there are nonsensical things that are kind of introduced, and that's kind of a couple. There's just lots of other small little things here. You get these kind of weird kind of characters that are introduced, and they have certain quirks. I mean, some are quite, there's like a Karen sort of character who always wants to kind of speak to the manager, which I think was quite funny. But there are certain characters that you spend a lot of time on initially, and then they're kind of like killed relatively early, and it's sort of, oh, you know, I wasn't expecting that sort of to be so early in the movie, because of why we've spent so much time on this character when he's one of the first ones alive, for example. So there's certainly some odd choices. It does feel this movie was, it feels like, and I'm speculating here, this film was kind of changed through the process of making it. I suspect it probably was initially going to be more like the movie Plane with Gerard Butler, but they kind of changed it because the actor wasn't available or something like this, and they've just kind of like done something different. But it just feels like it's kind of been done by the seat of their pants to a certain degree, because it just feels kind of disorganised. The effects, let's go back to that. Again, lower budget movie. I'm actually not expecting a great effect with a film like this, but I've got to address it. There are some VFX, there's some CGI effects, in particular when the plane crashes. that legitimately look like PlayStation 2 style graphics. It's quite shocking for a movie coming out this late after kind of the CGI boom and all this, but very, very cheap looking CGI. Now I will say that there's not loads of CGI sequences, so you're not having to watch this for large portions of the movie. There's just a few shots here and there, but the shots that we do see are of very poor quality. And then the actual practical side of stuff, the makeup, I'll be honest with you, I'm quite forgiving of it. I actually thought the makeup didn't look too bad. But there are a few shots here where you can kind of see like the rubber rings around the kind of the actors, kind of like where the mask is and kind of ends, and you can kind of see the actors' eyes underneath. They haven't done a huge, you know, a real kind of like particularly kind of like good job of really kind of, you know, making the makeup sort of blend in and things like that. It's just kind of like putting a mask, maybe a little bit kind of like black makeup around the eyes, and that's kind of jobs are good. So again, it has like very kind of that silly kind of lower budget kind of feel to it. As I've mentioned, the ending, without spoiling it, I actually quite liked it, but I do feel that some people might be a little unsatisfied, and it seems to kind of be a little abrupt, is all I'll say. The acting, yeah, it's you know, it's a low budget B movie, and the acting is consistent with that kind of level of film. Let me just say that. But there's very little characterization, as I've mentioned before. There's quite a lot of survivors here. We you know, we spend sort of a certain amount of time with some of them, but you know, we never really get a full-on central character with maybe Sarah French's character. But I don't know, I never really felt like we kind of got a decent amount of character building, and we didn't really feel like we were following a kind of particular kind of character and things like that. The action is quite plentiful, as I've mentioned, but there are some quite poor choreographed fight scenes where, you know, you can clearly see a punch is like miles away from like the actual kind of like the other person and things like that. So the kind of the actual the shooting of the kind of this fight sequences, again, either looks a little bit kind of slow, where people are kind of trying to move not to hit people, or it's kind of filmed in a not particularly good angle and stuff kind of like that. So it's a really rough movie, to be honest with you, with really kind of little consistent narrative through it. So how to rate this? So to me, this is not a good film in regards to looking at it with a critical lens, but there is entertainment value. I was genuinely kind of like enjoying it, but I will accept that this movie isn't a particularly kind of well put together film on a, you know, a technical level or an artistic level. I mean, it's competently made in regards to the filming, I suppose, but narratively it's just kind of a bit of a mess here, and it just seems to have been kind of like rushed through. But still having, you know, again, if you are at that kind of mindset where you can enjoy trash cinema, then yeah, there is entertainment value here. But I've got to think of it like, is it a good film or isn't it? And it isn't. So I'm going to give this one a below average mark of 4 out of 10, but it still has some entertainment value for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.